Hey everyone, it's Ian York, and this is going to be different from most of my other intros. Since this is just a continuation of the previous essay, I'm just going to clear up a few misconceptions that I should have made clearer in the previous video. I'm always trying to make my videos, especially my scripts, better, and I want to make sure my arguments are as clear as possible. So first of all, no, we don't literally live in a theocracy. In case people were confused, I was just saying the purpose of religious myths in a theocratic or Caesaro-Papist state is similar to the national myths used by modern nation states. They both use these inherently irrational concepts to try and gain legitimacy to support their power political games. But obviously they're not the same thing, and if you watch the video, I think it's easy to figure out they aren't. Please don't go around arguing that we live in a theocracy. Second, never think I'm making the argument that voting in reform or voting against fascism isn't important. I don't make that argument, and I don't think Rocker ever really made that argument. The issue with electoralism isn't that it doesn't work. The problem is that it doesn't work relative to the amount of energy you spend on it, whereas direct action works much better. We should participate in electoralism in the sense that we should vote, but just remember to never get complacent. We're anarchists. We'll always be against the state in whatever form it comes up, and we'll always be against unjust hierarchies in whatever form they come up. But yes, voting can help achieve some material conditions, and it can help us get to a point where direct action becomes much, much easier. Third is apple pie is shit, and it's objectively the worst of the fruit pies, and I will not budge on that. Fourth, nationalism isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just a load of shit. It's an irrational belief used to empower people to self-governance, and we're going to explain pretty soon why the idea of a nation is nonsense, but my point right now is to say that nationalism can be a sort of useful idiot for us, specifically when it can help fight Western, and, well, Eastern at this point, imperialism. Just imperialism in general, like in the case of the Kurds in Iraq. So nationalism can be used to do good things, but we should just be very skeptical of it. And speaking of Western imperialism, my last point of clarification is the fact that I talk about America so much because I'm an American, and also because America is the only actual country. Get wrecked, you silly Euros. Now, in all seriousness, I don't talk very much about Europe or the pernicious aspects of capitalism outside America, and I want to try to do more stuff about African and Asian anarchism, so be on the lookout for that. But for now, we have to ask a question. Constant tutelage of our acting and thinking has made us weak and irresponsible, hence the continued cry for the strong man who is to put an end to our distress. This call for a dictator is not a sign of strength, but a proof of inner lack of assurance and of weakness, even though those who try to utter it earnestly try to give themselves the appearance of resolution. No, really, what is a nation? Wikipedia describes it as a stable community of people formed on the basis of language, history, territory, ethnicity, or psychological makeup manifested in a certain culture. Now, I don't know what the fuck a psychological makeup manifested in a certain culture means, but all those previous things can be, if not quantified, at least qualified. As I said in the previous video, the idea of nationalism used to be based on language, the idea that we can communicate and share ideas with each other, but this actually wasn't the original meaning. The original meaning used to refer to scholars in different schools of the universities of the Middle Ages. The university at Prague had the nations of Bavarians, Bohemians, Poles, and Saxons. There were also nations of lawyers, doctors, mathematics, etc. The word nation comes from the Latin natio, which means place of origin, or where you're born. This seems to make the most sense, so let's start with territory. The idea of the nation based on a common territory, or a homeland, to co-opt some popular dog whistles, seemed to be a popular one. I mean, we talk a lot about our nation's borders, don't we? Well, after thinking about it for a bit, we quickly realized that this notion of a common territory is nonsense, because then you could say every city should be considered its own nation. Hell, why not every county? If we're serious about the idea that nation is based on the place we're born, then we shouldn't be talking about Americans, French, and British. We'd be talking about New Yorkers, Parisians, and Londoners, like the old city-states of Greece. So the idea that the nation is based on a common place of birth doesn't make sense in light of how much territory encompasses modern nation-states. Not to mention the completely arbitrary nature of borders. Are the people of Kashmir Pakistani, Chinese, or Indian? In 1864, the people of French Riviera went to sleep as Italians and woke up as French. In 1890, a bunch of bureaucrats and politicians in Germany and the UK decided that the island of Heligoland, which had been in the possession of Denmark for most of its history, was German property. Territory isn't decided where people live, it's decided by what power political players believe they have control over, and the people who actually live there have no choice in the matter. The idea of a nation based on a people in a specific territory just does not align with reality. But most people don't just say it's the circumstances of your birth. Let's talk about the nation as a community that shares a common history and traditions. This is meaningless in terms of nationality because everyone will interpret and interact with historical events that become ingrained in tradition in different ways. I, as a socialist, find the idea of revolution to destroy a corrupt, unjust system to be a great American tradition carried on from the founding fathers that must be carried forward from generation to generation. However, a conservative, or even another so-called socialist in some cases, would actually see that as an act of treason and believe that reactionary tendencies is part of a proud American tradition. The appeal to tradition is inherently subjective and incomprehensible because it's very rare that any group of large amounts of people will embrace traditions in the same way between individuals. It's just not really possible. And following the trend of subjective inconsistent standards, there's the idea that the nation is a community of national and intellectual interests. I'm pretty sure that's what psychological makeup manifested in a certain culture means anyways. This is an idea that's easy to debunk when you just look at how different classes and groups within a nation behave in relation to each other. The capitalist class never put any national interests above the chance to wring more money and line their pockets whenever they can. The same capital owners who boast about patriotism and national identity wheel and deal with enemy countries in order to line their pockets. Look at all the American companies wanting to pander to and establish themselves in the Chinese market. After the Ruhr conflict, the capitalists of the region demanded over 700 million marks from the Weimar government, and they were given it without a second thought. And even after coming out on top with massive profits, the German captains of industry never once thought that it would behoove them to help the German workers through the economic turmoil of the Weimar years in order to secure national interests. Look at how the top 1% of the United States made out with over $400 billion after the coronavirus panic. What common national interests can exist when one man can make a fortune off the labor of another without having to work themselves? What common interests do Jeff Bezos and an Amazon warehouse employee possibly have? It's a rhetorical question. They don't have any interests in common. The idea of a community of intellectual interests is barely even worth mentioning. The intellectual diversity of modern liberal democracies is greater than ever before, and conflict and contradict each other constantly. The intellectual conflict between people who live in the countryside and those who live in the cities is a tale as old as time. Just look at the conflicting political parties and the modern bourgeois democracies, and you can see this is nonsense. Ask 10 different people what they believe the intellectual interests of the nation are or should be, and I'll have 10, maybe 12 different intellectual pursuits. That is if they don't just outright ask what the fuck you're talking about. The idea that millions, sometimes billions of people can share a common intellectual pursuit is complete and utter nonsense. We also have to remember, however, the Enlightenment origins of nationalism, the nation as a common language. This seems to be a really intuitive argument. I mean, the reason I can explain to you why the idea of a nation is nonsense is because we're speaking a common language. It seems obvious that the basis of a nation is sharing a common language made by people of that nation. The problem with this is multifold. First is that languages aren't these simple things made by one people. Language is rather an ever-evolving, fluid thing made by everyone. English, a Germanic language, has 29% of its words borrowed from French, 29% derived from Latin, and only 26% derived from Germanic, 6% from Greek, and the rest from miscellaneous or unknown languages. English is rightly a product of French and German, which were a product of Latin and Slavic, which were a product of Turco-Mongol and Caucasian, which were themselves a product of Hindi and Chinese. No language is ever created by a definite people. We all create it. Language borrows, replaces, and changes all the time. Very rarely does it exist in a vacuum. Do you know what the difference between a dialect and a language is? It's politics. Or as linguist, Yiddishist Max Weinrich said, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy, meaning languages aren't decided upon how similar things are, they're decided on who has the biggest stick. Yet we have nations from all over the world that have multiple unintelligible languages. Tibetan is as different from Mandarin as English is from German, and yet they're both considered Chinese languages, because China conquered Tibet. In the same way, a Norwegian, a Dane, and a Swede can all have conversations with each other pretty easily, and yet they're all considered different languages. The modern Italian language is actually Tuscan Italian, and at the time Italy unified and made this the official language, only around 2.5% of the population could actually speak Tuscan Italian. In fact, if you're a Sicilian, you're not able to understand someone from Naples and vice versa. So if we're being consistent, we wouldn't be talking about an Italian nation. We'd be talking about a Venetian, Sicilian, Napolitano, Sardinian, Tuscan, and Lombardian nation. Lastly is the fact that our modern nation states don't follow the idea of the nation as a common language. If this was the case, then we wouldn't be talking about the nations of the United States of America, Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. We'd be talking about the Empire of Anglia or something. Not to mention how much of the world speaks Spanish, yet is divided into a bunch of small, different countries in Central and South America. Funnily enough, Spain itself has a bunch of different dialects within its borders. The idea that the nation is a community sharing a common language doesn't make sense with all the nations that exist today. The nation as a common race is something that's barely worth getting into, but I feel I need to address this one. If you think that nationality is tied to a specific race or ethnicity, you are a racist. What you're describing is an ethnostate where your preferred, arbitrarily defined racial archetype is dominant because only they have the specific characteristics required to make this vague concept of a nation make sense. If you're basing nationality on someone's genetics, then that's no different than basing it on where they're born. You can't determine genetics through phenotypical characteristics. I have more DNA in common with black people near where I live than a Hispanic guy in South America. This is a completely arbitrary standard, because race is a social construct, which is why Italians and Irish weren't considered white at one point, because the idea of race isn't based on any biological reality. Put a set of 10 Mongolians, Americans, and Spaniards together in a room, and you might think you have 3 racial archetypes. But in reality, each of those are as genetically distinct and varied as all the languages of the world. I'll say it very clearly. There is no concrete scientific basis for modern or pre-modern racial theory, and everyone who claims so is either purposely or stupidly misrepresenting biological realities in order to suit their narratives. Get your racist shit out of here. Now you might be thinking, okay Anyor, but it's really all these things put together that make a nation. You can't just judge it piece by piece. You need to take these all into account and realize that the nation is built around a common culture. Well, first of all, yes I can. Don't tell me what to do. Second of all, let me ask you, what is American culture? Because God knows that's poorly if at all coherently defined. I live in New York, and I have a radically different culture than someone from Texas, California, or Florida. Culturally, I share more in common with people in Toronto than I do a person from Alabama, so how come New York and Toronto aren't part of the same nation, yet New York and Miami are? The US started out as a melting pot of peoples from all over Europe, and now have people from all over the world, mixing and intermingling their culture in what has rightly been called a melting pot, and is now the greatest empire in history. Conversely, Central America, despite all sharing very similar cultures, football games, and the same language, is made up of 8 smaller states that are subject to US political machinations. The point of this section is that all these criteria are arbitrary. Even if we apply all of them, no country that we can consider a nation can meet these criteria because the criteria don't make sense, because they're based on fluid forms of human expression that arise from mass actions between individuals, irrespective of arbitrary lines drawn on a map by a bunch of politicians and bureaucrats. The nation state isn't created by this set of criteria. Rather, it uses these criteria in order to grant itself legitimacy and make it seem like it's following the ill-defined will of the masses. In reality, the nation-state is a series of abstractions used to fulfill the power political ambitions and well-being of a privileged minority. Doesn't matter if it's in the form of a theocratic dictatorship, in the form of Iran, or a supposed liberal democratic republic like the United States. And that's not saying the US is the same as Iran. The material conditions of workers and their ability to effect change in their respective states is better in some places than in others. What I'm trying to get at is that all states have certain quirks in common, one of them being to drape themselves in a people's culture to give legitimacy to their endeavors as the will of the people. But we've talked a lot about culture without really qualifying it. I mean, the title of the book is Nationalism and Culture. What even is this broad jumble of things and attitudes we've come to call culture? Well, we're going to talk about it. Like, now. Over the broad surface of the ocean, the sun increasingly draws up watery vapors to the skies. Clouds form and float, wind driven to the land where they discharge their garnered fullness and fall to the earth as fruitful rain. By millions the raindrops hide themselves within the bosom of the earth, and then from countless springs gush, laughing, out again upon its surface. Rivulets are formed, cut through the land in every direction, swell to a brook, a river, The river rolls its floods down again. Circa has gone on with irresistible certainty, unchanging, and it will continue, unbroken sequence, as long as the cosmic conditions of our solar system themselves endured unchanged. So we've talked a lot about culture in these two videos, but other than the third part of the last video, we haven't really done a deep dive into culture itself and how it relates to political power dynamics, specifically in terms of the ideas of the culture state and national culture. Let's continue this questioning of extremely vague concepts then. What is culture? We have a general idea of things in our head when someone says the word culture: art, literature, architecture, clothing. It's very broad, and it can encompass many things, including actions. You hear this all the time. It's their culture to do this. Why do they do that? It's just their culture. Why did that mob kill that person? Because they created a toxic culture. Why did you quit your job? I didn't like the company culture. Not to mention how culture affects politics and laws in a given region, and how it's used as a justification for or against certain laws. Cultural homogeneity is a very popular dog whistle used in my country and others in order to justify laws against immigration and treating people of other nationalities like human beings. And speaking of ethics, is that also not part of culture? If you read Hegel, Kant, and a bunch of other old white guys who spend too much time thinking about things, then culture would be an issue of morality. So how do we create a consistent standard of culture that will let us distinguish between high and low culture, and strong and weak culture? Well, the easy answer is you don't, but we're not here for easy answers. Let's look at the origins of the word culture, the Latin phrase cultura. This word was used to describe agriculture, the taming of animals and such things. And here we can set up a basis where culture is the subjugation of natural processes by humans in order to align them with human aims and desires. Tools, houses, weapons, clothing, and the use of fire become the first basis for what can be considered a culture. Out of this grows agriculture, and we already have a difference between nature peoples who continue to live off the land, hunting and gathering, and civilized quote-unquote people who decide to do this brand new thing called farming. Or as anthropologist David Graeber said, culture is basically choosing not to do that thing your neighbor does. From this comes art, storytelling, writing, religion, and then architecture, and then arise laws and governments, and power politics, and the quirks and nuances each society develops become what we call a culture. And so, instead of the old adage of civilized being a word to differentiate between those like us and those not like us, we can say a civilization is a group of peoples who can use natural processes to change their environment to better suit them. This way, steppe nomads that move from place to place to find the best, most temperate lands for grazing, hunting, and gathering fruits and herbs are a cultured civilization, as well as the Chinese dynasties or Greek city-states. No more of this arbitrary and kind of racist delineation. Slavery and despotism, freedom and democracy, hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists, all are cultural values that come from within and without. Now, that's not saying that cultures are all on the same level or are all as pervasive. There's a reason why the Mongols were able to conquer China militarily, but were conquered by the Chinese culturally. And there's a reason why American society is exported all over the world. Let's talk about this idea of cultural homogeneity. Sounds simple enough. A single culture that, for the most part, is rather consistent and ubiquitous throughout a society. If you've been paying attention so far, however, you'd realize very quickly that this is nonsense. As mentioned above, America is a huge hodgepodge of different cultures, depending on where you go, and yet despite this, it's the strongest culture in all of human history. Go almost anywhere in the world, and you'll find people wearing t-shirts, jeans. Why? Well, a multitude of factors. Many people would argue because, as the world hegemon, the United States can export our culture everywhere. And while this definitely plays a factor, we can't forget the nature of American culture, its origins, and how this allows us to adapt to integrate many other cultures within us. Because what is a strong culture? Well, taking into consideration what we've mentioned so far, especially remember that Graeber quote, I think it's fair to say a strong culture is one that can take in many different aspects of many different cultures and incorporate it into itself. That's what makes American culture so prevalent. As I said before, the United States started out as a melting pot, a mishmash of cultures from all over Europe and some parts outside of Europe that are jumbled into this brew we call Americana. And ever since the country's founding, different peoples from all around the world came and added to its culture, strengthening it further. Every city across the country you'll find stores and restaurants from China, India, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and people from all these different parts of the world. All these different cultures aren't separate from American culture, but an integral part of it, and the reason why the culture is so strong. This is the case for every other country. There's a special experience one can get in Sicily that one can't get in Rome or Venice. Just like there's an experience one can get in Edinburgh they can't really get in London or Cardiff. This idea of cultural homogeneity is a complete fantasy, because there's no such thing as a homogeneous culture. Every culture borrows and incorporates parts of others into its own. Ancient Greece borrowed many aspects of its culture from the Persians. Rome borrowed its wholesale from the Greeks, though the way they viewed gods and their aspects was different, as well as adopting things like the creation of shields and chainmail from the Celts they ended up conquering. And the Celts and Germanic peoples ended up borrowing many cultural innovations and ideas from the Romans themselves. There's no such thing as a homogeneous culture. To believe there is, you need to either be ignorant to historical realities or a race realist. And this idea that so many people these days seem to have, that we can somehow preserve existing culture and certain values by shutting all the peoples of the world off to each other, is not only stupid and misinformed, it's subjecting these cultures to downright suicide. As Rocker said, such disheartened ideas have about the same meaning as saying to a man that he can attain the highest state of manhood only if he eliminates woman from his life. The result will be the same in both cases. So with that being said, I think it logically follows that the reason for the development of a strong culture, such as one we see in the United States, isn't only because of its national unity, but actually in spite of it. It's an easy conclusion to come to when you consider what we've been establishing so far. The strongest cultures are ones that adopt the many different aspects of other cultures into their own, and all cultures are an amalgam of other cultures to the point where the idea of speaking of a culture arising independently is nonsense. And so the best way to develop a strong culture is by a decentralized model of political organization, because the decentralized people are much more likely to be free to explore and interact with their environment and add to their cultural wealth. In all human history, culture hasn't been made by a hierarchical, centralized state, but used by these and suppressed these new modes of thought in order to serve the state's interests. Throughout most examples we can point to in history, a centralized state that ruled over large segments of a group of people has always tried to suppress human culture to set the population to its ends, and this has been the case even in so-called worker states throughout history. We see this today in China, where Tibetans and Uyghurs are ethnically cleansed to bring these groups in line with the wishes of the dictatorship of the Politburo. We've seen this play out positively in America, where our federalist system allows a richer and more diverse culture than has ever been seen rise up from the myriad of possible social interactions that exist today. And we've seen it negatively where the rich cultures of the First Nations was annihilated by American states' doctrines of expansion and manifest destiny. Think of all the ingenious and beautiful cultural developments lost in ethnic cleansings perpetuated by the nascent United States. Think of how much greater and richer the country would have been if we had participated in meaningful, welcoming cultural exchange with the people of the First Nations, and how much more of a truly free and open democracy we would have been. Now imagine the bloom of culture and development that can arise when the free and open movement of peoples that for so long has been restricted through these arbitrary lines in the sand we call borders is seen as a human right. These lines drawn by bureaucrats and dictators would be seen for what they are, and people would say, all the earth belongs to all peoples and no one can own it for themselves. Think of how much globalization has enriched our cultures today, how we read the works of Shakespeare, listen to the symphonies of Mozart, stare in awe at the paintings of Rembrandt, and draw inspiration from thousands of essays of Voltaire. Now imagine the rich explosion of culture that would arise in a free society where capital isn't used to gatekeep most people from adding to their culture, and instead people live in a society based on economic, political, and social justice, where they're allowed to unleash their natural creative urge in whichever way it may appear. And we bring it all back to this. The idea of a national culture is ludicrous, because culture knows no state or borders. Culture is for all people. Saying that a specific culture belongs to a specific people is as arbitrary as saying that the English language belongs only to Americans, or that Hindi should only be learned by North Indians. That is the lie of national culture. The idea that a specific nation or group created culture for themselves, and the state is a result of this nation. In reality, culture is created by and for all peoples of the world. German culture was created by influxes of Slavic and steppe cultures, which were influenced by Far Eastern cultures, which were in turn influenced by Middle Eastern and South Asian culture. In the final analysis, the state isn't a product of national culture, but the idea of a national culture which trains people into accepting it in the same way that people are indoctrinated into a religion. In the final analysis, we have to accept that this blind idolization of the state that we see everywhere today is a result of indoctrination and manufactured consent. People are products of their environment, and the environment we live in today is one of fear-mongering and blind obedience to power. This is why the orthodox Marxist class reductionist view can't bring any meaningful attempts at freedom for the working class. Capitalism is doomed to fail. Its contradictions are too great to forever maintain a stable working society. The bubble will burst one day. When that happens, we'll have a choice to make. We can either live in a truly free society based on the ideals of social and economic justice, and the belief that every individual should be given the opportunity to enrich their community, their lives, and the lives of their fellow man. Or we can live in a fascist reaction that wears the garbs and regalia of an ideology that works for the people in order to subject them to the will of a privileged minority, and will have all the functions of daily life serve as just another cog in a cold, inhuman machine. If we don't try to stop this Caesarean madness, realize that the achievements of mankind are only possible through the cooperation of all peoples, and work towards a truly free and equal future, then there's no recourse for us. We're doomed. I'll end this off with a final quote from Rocker, because he ended his book better than I think I ever could. The sense of dependence on a higher power, that source of all religious and political bondage, which ever chains man to the past and blocks the path to a brighter future, will yield place to an enlightenment which makes man himself the master of his fate. Here also Nietzsche's saying holds true. Not where you come from will from now on rebound to your honor, but whither you are going, you will in your foot, which tries to outrun you, that shall be your new honor.